While millions of Americans tune in every evening to watch Bret Baier deliver the day's most important news from behind the Fox News anchor desk.
For years, Bret Baier has been one of the most steady, composed, and respected faces on Fox News. Viewers trust him, colleagues admire him, and the network relies on him to bring clarity during the most uncertain moments in America. But while the camera has always captured his professionalism, what it never revealed was the difficult personal battle building behind that calm exterior. And just recently, heartbreaking news surrounding the veteran journalist has left millions stunned. The announcement came quietly, far quieter than anyone expected for a man whose presence commands national attention. It wasn't part of a televised segment, nor was it delivered mid-broadcast. Instead, Bret spoke about it with a heaviness in his voice that longtime viewers had never seen before. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and this time, it wasn't politics, world events, or breaking news. It was personal, behind the scenes. Baier has been juggling a weight that even his closest followers never fully understood. Those who know him describe a man who works relentlessly, rarely slowing down, rarely showing cracks. But the strain finally showed. Whether it was a health scare, a family emergency, or a devastating loss, what Bret revealed has left fans shaken. His colleagues were among the first to respond, some offering support publicly, others reaching out privately, knowing how much the anchor has carried on his shoulders over the past few years. For a man whose job is to deliver the news, becoming the center of it is never easy. And for Bret Baier, this moment marked one of the most difficult chapters of his life, one that would test his resilience, his faith, and his ability to move forward while the world watched. The heartbreaking truth behind Bret Baier's announcement has finally surfaced, and it's far more emotional than anyone expected. For years, Bret Baier has been one of the most steady, composed, and respected faces on American television. Viewers across the country have relied on him to break down the chaos of the world with clarity and calmness. His voice, measured, confident, and steady, became something people trusted, especially in moments when the rest of the world felt uncertain. But behind that composed anchor's desk, far away from the bright studio lights and polished scripts, something was happening in Bret's personal life that few people knew about. And when the heartbreaking news finally came out, it shocked even those who had followed him for decades. It all began quietly, almost unnoticed. Baier continued to show up on the air, delivering the day's biggest stories with professionalism, but off camera, he was confronting something far more personal, something no newsroom could prepare him for. Friends closest to him later revealed that there were days when Bret would step away from the camera during commercial breaks, not to adjust his tie or review notes, but to gather himself emotionally. He didn't want the audience to worry. He didn't want anyone to see the weight he was carrying. His job required strength, and he was determined to give viewers the same steady Bret Baier they had always known. But the truth is, no matter how strong someone appears on television, they are still human. And Bret's life was about to be shaken in a way that would remind millions of that fact. The heartbreaking news centered around his family, his greatest source of joy and the part of his life he has always tried to protect from the spotlight. Bret Baier has never been one to parade his personal struggles publicly. If anything, he has always guarded his private world fiercely, sharing only glimpses when absolutely necessary. But some stories are too big to hide. Some moments change everything. When the news first surfaced, many believed it couldn't be true. Viewers were so accustomed to Baier's unwavering presence that it was hard to imagine something truly devastating happening behind the scenes. Yet the reality was even harder than anyone expected. It was a situation that tested him, pushed him, and forced him to confront emotions he had never experienced so publicly before. More than anything, Bret found himself fighting to balance two worlds: the professional world, where he was expected to remain composed, and the personal world where everything felt fragile. There were nights when he left the studio long after dark, parking his car in the same spot he always did, but sitting there for minutes before even opening the door. He would replay the day, replay the conversations, replay the news he had to process, not as an anchor, but as a husband, a father, and a man trying to stay strong for his family. Insiders later admitted that many on the production team had sensed something was wrong. Long before the public knew, Bret was still professional, still dedicated, still focused, but there was a heaviness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He avoided small talk, kept to himself more than usual, and spent a lot of time on his phone checking messages from home. But no one pried. Everyone respected him too much to ask. The newsroom became quieter around him, as if subconsciously giving him space to breathe. Then came the moment when Baier finally spoke up, the moment when the heartbreaking truth had to be acknowledged. Viewers who had tuned in expecting a typical news broadcast were instead met with a more vulnerable version of the anchor. His voice was steady, but there was a softness in it, something real, something human. And when he explained what was happening, the world suddenly understood the way he had been carrying in a single moment. Bret Baier stopped being just a news anchor. He became a father in pain, a husband trying to hold everything together, and a man navigating one of the hardest chapters of his life. The heartbreaking news spread quickly, and the reaction was overwhelming. Messages poured in from viewers, colleagues, politicians, and even people who had disagreed with him on screen countless times. It was a rare moment of unity, proof that beyond politics, beyond networks, beyond headlines, people still cared deeply about the person behind the camera. But for Bret, this was only the beginning. The real challenge, the emotional, personal, deeply human journey was just starting. When Bret Baier returned home after those long evenings in the newsroom, the quiet inside his house felt heavier than ever. The familiar walls, once filled with laughter, warmth, and the everyday chaos of family life, now seemed to absorb the weight of everything he was carrying. The heartbreaking news had changed the rhythm of the Baier household, and every room felt like a reminder of the uncertainty that lay ahead. At the center of it all was his family, his anchor, his motivation, and now the heart of the crisis he was trying to navigate. Bret had always put them first, even while managing one of the most demanding jobs in American media. But this time, he found himself in a position where no amount of professional experience could help him. This wasn't something he could research, report, or explain to millions of viewers. This was personal, deeply personal. Each morning, before heading to the studio, Bret would spend extra time with his family, offering reassurance even when he didn't feel it himself. He wanted his children to see strength, not fear. He wanted his wife to know that he was with her, shoulder to shoulder, even on the days when the worry felt almost suffocating. But the truth is, some mornings were harder than others. Some days, the emotional exhaustion sat so heavily on his chest that even tying his tie felt like a struggle. Behind closed doors, Bret was fighting a silent battle, one he didn't want the world to see. Only a handful of close friends knew the details of what the family was going through. Bret had a tight circle, trusted people he had known for years. They were the ones he called late at night when sleep refused to come. They were the ones who understood that sometimes he didn't need advice, just someone to listen. And they were the ones who reminded him, gently and consistently, that even the strongest people are allowed to break down. But what made the situation even harder was the nature of his job. For most people going through a personal tragedy, stepping back from work is an option. For Bret, it wasn't that simple. He was the face millions of people tuned in to watch. His absence would raise questions, spark headlines, and create exactly the kind of attention he didn't want. So he pressed on, day after day, delivering the news while silently carrying a story of his own. Producers noticed small changes. He paused more often during breaks. He sipped water between segments, not because he was thirsty, but because it gave him a moment to breathe. When he looked into the camera, he still held that same steady tone, but there was a heaviness in his eyes that viewers couldn't quite place, though they certainly felt it. At home, the challenge was different. In the quiet moments, late night conversations, doctor updates, and the constant fear of what might come next, Bret struggled with a mix of emotions he rarely allowed himself to express publicly. Fear, frustration, hope, grief, all of it tangled together, demanding to be felt, even when he didn't want to. Yet through it all, there was one thing that remained unshakable: Bret's determination to protect his family. He made sure his children never saw the worst of his worry. He ensured his home remained a place of comfort, not chaos. And he kept his faith close, relying on it in ways he hadn't needed to before. But even with his strength, the pressure was immense. Some nights, after everyone had gone to sleep, Bret would sit alone in the living room, the glow of a small lamp casting long shadows across the floor. In those moments, he allowed himself to feel everything he had pushed aside throughout the day. The fear, the sadness, the weight of not knowing what tomorrow would bring. Viewers started noticing subtle changes first. A longer pause before transitioning to the next segment. A slight tremble in his voice when discussing certain subjects. A distant look in his eyes as if his mind were somewhere far away, somewhere no camera could reach. Social media lit up almost immediately. Is Bret okay? He doesn't seem like himself tonight. Something feels different. Hope he's all right. These weren't criticisms, they were concerns. Genuine, heartfelt concerns from people who had welcomed him into their living rooms for years. People who had grown accustomed to his steadiness in moments of national uncertainty. People who felt, in their own way, connected to him. Back at the studio, his closest colleagues also felt the shift. While he pushed forward with professionalism, it was becoming harder to hide the emotional exhaustion behind his eyes. Co-workers who normally laughed and chatted with him during commercial breaks noticed the silence. He spent most of his off-camera moments staring down at his notes, not reading them, just focusing on something to keep himself grounded. But it wasn't until one particular broadcast that everything changed. Midway through the show, Bret paused for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable to the untrained eye. But to longtime viewers, that brief hesitation felt like a window into something much deeper. The moment carried a vulnerability they had rarely, if ever, seen from him before. It wasn't dramatic or theatrical. It was human, authentic, real. When the broadcast ended that night, Bret remained at the desk longer than usual, staring at the empty studio. The lights dimmed, the crew packed up, and the room grew unbelievably quiet. It was in that silence that he realized something, no matter how hard he tried. The pain he was carrying was beginning to spill into his work. And in a job where millions watched every expression, every breath, every shift in tone, that meant people were going to start asking questions. And they did. The following morning, the messages became even more overwhelming. Emails from viewers, notes from longtime fans, and even texts from political figures who rarely showed emotion. All of them said the same thing in different ways. We're here for you. You've given us strength. Now let us support you. You don't have to pretend to be invincible. For the first time, Bret realized he wasn't facing this storm alone. The public had noticed. They didn't know the details, nor did they need to. They simply saw a man, someone they trusted, struggling, and their instinct was compassion. It was a rare, raw moment of unity in a world that so often disagreed about everything. But as comforting as the support was, it also came with a new kind of pressure. Soon, the world would expect answers, the heartbreaking truth, the private struggle, the emotional weight he was carrying. It couldn't stay hidden forever. And the moment when Bret would finally have to speak openly about what was happening was approaching much faster than he ever expected. The pressure had been quietly building for weeks-long nights, heavy conversations at home, and the growing sense that the public could feel something was wrong. Bret Baier had held it together longer than most people could have imagined. He showed up, night after night, delivering the news with discipline and dignity. But even the strongest people have a breaking point, and for Bret, that moment came on a night that began like any other. He arrived at the studio early, as he always did, reviewing notes and preparing for the broadcast. Producers could tell something was different. He was quieter than usual. His focus was sharp, almost too sharp, like someone forcing themselves to stay upright when their strength is slipping. Even his smile, polite, practiced, familiar, felt faint. Just minutes before the show went live, Bret stepped away from the desk to check his phone. One message was waiting for him. The moment he read it, everything inside him shifted. He didn't react outwardly. No one on set saw the change, but internally, it felt like the ground had dropped beneath him. It was the kind of message that forces you to stop, breathe, and remind yourself to keep going even when your heart feels like it's shattering. Still, when the cameras started rolling, Bret did what he always did. He showed up. He pushed through the lead stories. He kept his tone steady. He kept his posture straight. But halfway through the broadcast, Something happened that hadn't happened before, not even on his hardest days. His voice caught. Just for a second. Just long enough for him to feel it. He tried to continue, but the words didn't come out the way they were supposed to. And in that split second, he made a decision that would change everything, not as a journalist, but as a human being. He paused. Not the controlled pause of a broadcaster adjusting to breaking news. Not the brief silence used for dramatic effect. This was something different. Something real. Something vulnerable. Millions of viewers watched as Bret Baier, usually calm, composed, unshakable, looked down, took a breath, and then lifted his eyes again. In that moment, he wasn't reading from a script. He wasn't reporting a headline. He was simply trying to keep his composure while carrying a pain the world couldn't see. The control room froze. Producers exchanged glances. Camera operators held their breath. Everyone sensed that this wasn't a technical issue or a forgotten line. This was human emotion breaking through the professional facade. When the show finally cut to commercial, Bret leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. The weight of everything he had been hiding felt suddenly impossible to hold. A member of the crew quietly approached him, a young producer who had worked on his team for years. She didn't say much. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "You don't have to do this alone." It was the first time anyone had said those words to him. After the show ended, Bret didn't rush out of the studio. He stayed behind, sitting alone in the dimly lit room. The screens were dark, the crew had gone home, and the silence wrapped around him like a confession. He knew the moment he had tried so hard to avoid had finally come. He would have to speak publicly about what his family was going through, not because of pressure, not because of headlines, but because people cared, because they could sense his pain, and hiding it any longer felt impossible. By the time he walked out of the studio and into the cool night air, Bret had made a promise to himself. Tomorrow, he would tell the truth, not all of it, not the personal details that belonged only to his family, but enough for people to understand why he hadn't been himself, enough to lift the weight he had been carrying alone. The heartbreaking confession he had been avoiding was finally coming, and when he spoke the next day, millions would be watching.